Most people think their lives follow a map, neat lines and confident arrows pointing somewhere that makes sense. But Arthur had spent 40 years selling paper lies to people who wanted destiny printed in ink, and he knew how easily a single crooked line could send someone wandering in circles until they forgot where they were trying to go. Arthur didn't just appreciate precision, he was held hostage by it. He lived his life like the rigid cartography charts he peddled. Clean lines, defined borders, absolutely no smudges. The shop on the corner of Elm and Main wasn't just a business. It was a sanctuary of controlled silence. If a ledger was 2 millimeters out of alignment, Arthur felt it in his teeth. Every morning, Arthur wiped imaginary dust from the same 3 spots on his counter, even when they were already clean, because the idea of something being out of place made his jaw tighten like he was biting down on a secret. He was 68 years old, and every morning he waited for that thin blade of sunlight to crawl across the front window at exactly 7, sitting stiff behind the counter with his coffee going cold. Because if it arrived even a minute late, his stomach would twist and his hands would start to shake, as if some invisible gear inside him had slipped out of alignment. But on a Tuesday that felt like any other, the precise geometry of Arthur's life was about to be challenged by something that could not be measured with a compass. For 10 years, the chair opposite Arthur's desk had remained empty, a constant reminder of the partnership he had lost. That chair had belonged to Silas, his oldest friend, the man who had helped him build the business from the ground up until a bitter argument over the sale of the shop tore them apart. Arthur had chosen the building, the walls, the deed, the illusion of permanence. Silas had chosen to walk out with nothing but his coat and his anger, slamming the door so hard it rattled the windows and left Arthur staring at a dustless counter that suddenly felt like a coffin. Since that day, Arthur had convinced himself that he was better off alone, stacking his pride around him like stone walls, telling himself that isolation was strength even while the silence gnawed at him every night. But as he sorted through the morning mail, his fingers stopped on an envelope made of heavy, cream-colored paper, the kind that didn't belong to bills or advertisements, and when he recognized the slanted, impatient handwriting from a decade ago, something inside his chest split open so fast it almost stole his breath. He stared at the letter for a long time, the silence of the shop suddenly feeling heavy and suffocating rather than peaceful. He remembered the day Silas left, the sound of the door slamming, a sound that had echoed in Arthur's mind for years. He had told himself that Silas was reckless, that he didn't understand the value of preservation, but deep down, Arthur knew the argument hadn't really been about the shop. It had been about fear. Arthur's fear of change and Silas's need for growth. He placed the unopened letter on the desk, terrified to read it, because opening it would mean admitting that the silence he had curated was not peace, but loneliness. Finally, with trembling fingers, he tore the envelope open. It was short, written in Silas's sprawling, energetic script. It wasn't an apology, nor was it an accusation. It was a simple request. I found the map we never finished. I'm at the old lighthouse cottage. Come find me. Arthur looked at the clock on the wall. It was ticking steadily, marking time that he could never get back. He knew he could burn the letter, lock the door, and go back to his safe, predictable world. But as he looked at the empty chair, he realized that safety had become a prison, and the key was waiting for him at a lighthouse 30 miles away. The drive to the coast was a journey through memories Arthur had tried to suppress. He passed the diner where they used to drink coffee and plan their futures, and the park where they had celebrated their first big sale. He felt a wave of resistance, his mind conjuring up every reason to turn the car around. Silas would be different, the meeting would be awkward, too much time had passed. But every time he thought about hitting the brakes, he pictured the unfinished map mentioned in the letter. It was a project they had started 20 years ago, a map not of a place, but of the local stars and tides, and the mystery of why Silas had kept it all this time pulled Arthur forward. He arrived at the coast just as the afternoon sky was beginning to turn a bruised purple. The lighthouse cottage stood on a bluff, its paint peeling and its windows dark, stubbornly upright against the wind, and Arthur hated how much it reminded him of himself, still standing, still rigid, and quietly falling apart underneath. He sat in his car for a moment, gripping the steering wheel, his heart hammering against his ribs. This was the moment of decision. If he walked up that path, he would have to admit he was wrong, or at least that he wasn't entirely right. He took a deep breath, stepped out into the salty air, and looked up at the cottage, wondering if the man inside was a friend or still a stranger. A young woman opened the door before Arthur could knock. She had Silas's eyes, bright and inquisitive. She introduced herself as Clara, Silas's daughter, a girl Arthur hadn't seen since she was a toddler. She smiled warmly, but there was a hesitation in her manner that made Arthur's stomach drop. She told him that Silas was resting, that he had been tired lately, and that he had been waiting for Arthur all day. She stepped aside to let him in, and as Arthur crossed the threshold, he felt a sudden panic that perhaps he had waited too long, and that some distances were too great to be bridged. The interior of the cottage was filled with books and charts, a chaotic reflection of Silas's mind. Clara led him to a sunroom overlooking the ocean, where Silas sat in a large armchair, a blanket draped over his legs. He looked older, frail, his hair completely white. Arthur felt a sting of tears. He had missed the transformation of his best friend. Silas looked up, his eyes narrowing as he adjusted to the light. For a second, there was no recognition, just a blank stare, and Arthur felt the crushing weight of a decade of silence crashing down on him. Then Silas smiled. It wasn't the boisterous grin of their youth, but a soft, relieved curving of the lips. He didn't stand up, but he gestured to the chair beside him. They sat in silence for a moment, the sound of the waves filling the space between them. Silas didn't bring up the argument, and neither did Arthur. Instead, Silas reached under a stack of magazines and pulled out a large, rolled-up piece of parchment. He handed it to Arthur. It was the map, but as Arthur unrolled it, he saw that Silas had added something that changed everything he thought he knew about their past. The map was covered in new lines, annotations, and corrections. Silas began to speak, his voice raspy but steady. He explained that after he left, he had traveled, trying to verify the calculations they had made together. Silas tapped the parchment, his fingernail yellowed and uneven. "You remember the Mercator projection?" he asked, his voice cracking on the vowels. "It's a trick, Artie. A standard lie we tell ourselves. It takes the poles, the cold edges of the world, and stretches them. It distorts the scale, so the further you get from the center, the more terrifyingly huge everything looks. It makes the scary stuff look massive, unconquerable, but it's just math playing tricks on your eyes." Silas whispered that their anger had been like that projection, distorting the size of their problems, making small disagreements look like insurmountable continents. Arthur stared at the warped continents on the parchment and felt something ugly crawl up his throat, because he suddenly saw his own life in those stretched lines, every fear magnified, every mistake blown up so large that he had used it as an excuse to stay small. But there was still a heaviness in the room. Silas began to cough, a deep, rattling sound that shook his thin frame. Clara rushed in to help him, and Arthur stood back, feeling like an intruder in this intimate moment of care. He saw the reality of Silas's condition. He wasn't just tired, he was fading. The fear that he had arrived only to say goodbye paralyzed Arthur. He wanted to run, to spare himself the pain of losing Silas twice, once to anger and once to time. He backed toward the door, his hand reaching for the knob. Just as his hand touched the cold metal, Clara spoke. She didn't look at him, focused entirely on her father, but her words were clearly meant for Arthur. She said he talked about Arthur every week, sometimes more when the nights were bad and he couldn't sleep, and that there was never anger in his voice, just this soft, crack kind of missing. The way someone keeps glancing at an empty chair at the table and pretending it doesn't hurt to see it there. Arthur froze. He realized that the narrative he had built, the story of the villain Silas who abandoned him, was a fiction. The villain wasn't Silas at all. It was the small, tight-fisted part of Arthur that would rather be right and alone than wrong and hurting in someone else's arms. He let go of the doorknob. He knew he couldn't leave. The only way out was through the pain. He walked back to the chair and sat down, moving closer this time. When Silas recovered his breath, he looked at Arthur with an intensity that pierced through the years. Silas pointed to a specific star drawn on the upper corner of the parchment. He reminded Arthur of Polaris, the North Star, which sits almost perfectly above the Earth's celestial pole, appearing motionless while the entire northern sky revolves around it. Silas said, "You were my Polaris, Arthur. I spun around in circles out there, but I always knew where you were. I just didn't know how to navigate back." Arthur felt the dam break. The pride that had held him together dissolved into gratitude. He reached out and took Silas's hand, the skin paper thin and warm. He didn't offer a grand speech. He simply said, "I'm here now. We can finish the map." It wasn't about the parchment anymore. It was about finishing the story of their friendship properly. They spent the next hour working on the edges of the drawing, Arthur holding the pen, Silas guiding his hand with words. They laughed about the old shop, about the customers, about the mistakes they had made. As the sun began to set, casting a golden light over the ocean, the map was finished. Silas leaned back, exhausted but peaceful, a look of profound satisfaction on his face. He closed his eyes, his breathing evening out into a rhythmic sleep. Clara came in and put a hand on Arthur's shoulder, squeezing it gently. She didn't need to say anything. The gratitude in her eyes was enough. Arthur rolled up the map, but this time he didn't feel the need to hoard it or protect it. The realization hit him harder than the salt air. This wasn't a map to a geographic location. There was no buried gold or secret island. It was a topographical survey of their own stubbornness. It was a jagged, hand-drawn guide to the one thing Arthur had refused to navigate for a decade: forgiveness. The lines didn't mark land. They marked the difficult, winding currents back to each other, cutting across the vast, distorted ocean of their pride. Arthur left the cottage as the first stars began to appear. He walked to his car, carrying the map under his arm. The drive home was different. The silence in the car wasn't lonely, it was contemplative. He thought about the empty chair in his shop. He decided that tomorrow he wouldn't just sit there. He would invite Clara to visit. He would tell the stories of the map maker who helped him find his way back. He realized that the lines from the past would always be there, crooked and stubborn, but maybe, just maybe, he was finally brave enough to draw over them and make something new, even if his hand still shook while he tried. And as he drove under the vast, starlit canopy, Arthur felt a warmth in his chest that no map could ever measure.